Can you picture a convoy of livestock trailers grinding up a dirt road into a desert where even the deer struggle to find water? Inside them is an animal that hasn't stood on this ground in more than a century. And the plan, the entire plan, is to swing those gates open, walk back to the trucks, drive away, and let that animal bring a dying landscape back to life on its own. No fences, no feed, no water hauled in for the dry months. No backup plan of any kind. Over 250 bison went into that landscape. The people who put them there left, and almost everyone who watched it happen believed they had just witnessed the beginning of a slow-motion slaughter. This was Utah's Henry Mountains in 2014. Look at what they were released into. Not prairie, not rolling grass under open sky. High desert valleys, jagged ridges, windswept plateaus. Elevations climbing from 6,000 feet to over 11,000. Summers that bake the ground until it cracks. Winters that bury it under snow by early fall. Sagebrush, juniper. Scattered grasses clinging to thin, poor soil. Barely enough forage to carry mule deer through a hard year. It read less like a sanctuary than a survival test. And the animals arriving there were not supposed to be there at all. 200 years ago, the horizon of this continent rippled with dark moving mass. 30 to 60 million bison. They were not passengers on the Great Plains. They were the engine that ran it. Hooves broke the crust of the soil. Bodies rolled hollows that filled with rain. Grazing moved constantly and never stayed long enough to kill anything. Then the killing started. By 1900, fewer than 1,000 animals remained on the entire continent. Almost every one of them stood behind a fence, and what replaced them behaved nothing like them. Cattle linger. They graze a valley down to the nub and stay. Hooves press the earth into lifeless slabs that shed water instead of drinking it. Rain arrives and runs straight off, and the topsoil goes with it. Across enormous stretches of the American West, the land turned brittle. The bison were not simply absent. Their function was absent, and nothing else was doing that job. For decades, we tried to do it ourselves. Fire suppression, irrigation, hand seeding, helicopters flying grids over degraded rangeland, dropping seed pods onto ground too compacted to receive them. Fences, pesticides, permits, management plans. Enormous budgets aimed at the symptoms of a missing animal. Some of it helped, much of it didn't hold. The moment the funding stopped, the land slid back. By the early 2000s, a handful of ecologists were saying something the profession found uncomfortable. You cannot restore a system by managing its parts. You have to return the species that held the whole thing together. But the good land was gone. The fertile grasslands were spoken for. Agriculture, development, politics, private title. If bison were coming back, they needed a canvas nobody else wanted. So, the Division of Wildlife Resources, backed by the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, looked at a remote patch of high desert in southern Utah and made a decision that sounded, to nearly everyone, like a mistake. Part of it was practical. Yellowstone had surplus animals and nowhere to put them. Part of it was scientific. The Henry Mountains had one rare quality. They had never been chewed to dust by a century of cattle. The soils were thin, but they still held the memory of native plants. Remote, undeveloped, and big enough for animals to roam without running into people. And the rules they set were the truly radical part. Let bison be bison, free roaming, migratory, wild. No supplementary feeding, no forced breeding, no roundups unless absolutely necessary. Whatever happened out there would happen without a human hand steadying it. The release itself had no ceremony, no press conference, no ribbon cutting, no crowd, no photographers. Trailers rattling through sagebrush and sandstone, gates swinging open, a blur of hooves and muscle, dust hanging in the thin desert air. A handful of biologists with clipboards standing in silence while the animals scattered into the canyons. Then, everybody left. The reaction came fast. Ranchers called it reckless. They held grazing allotments their families had worked for generations, and now there were wild animals loose on them, competing for forage, potentially carrying brucellosis, impossible to manage once they were over a ridge. To them, this was an experiment being run at their expense. Locals called it naive, a joke. One rancher told a Salt Lake City journalist in 2015, "They're prairie animals. You don't drop buffalo in the desert and expect anything but bones." An ecologist put it in 4 words: bison don't belong here. And, privately off the record, some of the biologists involved did not expect the herd to last more than a few seasons. Nobody was rooting for a disaster, but nobody was donating, promoting, or expecting anything either. Then came the first year, and the first year was worse than failure. It was nothing. The bison vanished. Biologists had prepared for dramatic sightings, for animals holding the valley bottoms where the forage was. Instead, the herd dissolved into the landscape. Tourists drove out and came home with empty camera rolls. Locals joked that the buffalo had walked off the edge of the map. Even the collar data was confusing. The animals kept climbing. Again and again, GPS points moving uphill, away from the meadows, into rocky highlands with almost nothing growing on them. From a human point of view, it looked suicidal. Population counts stayed flat. Birth rates were low. Critics felt vindicated, and behind closed doors there were conversations about quietly pulling the plug. But the animals were not starving, and they were not panicking. They were doing something nobody had thought to watch for. They were mapping a range they had never seen, learning where water sat after a storm, where snow blew clear in winter. The disappearance was not the beginning of a collapse. It was the foundation of a herd. And the first real evidence that something had changed did not come from the bison at all. It came from dirt. Biologists walking transects after seasonal rain started noticing a difference in the ground where the animals had passed. Where water once beaded on the hard crust and ran off, it was now soaking in, down through tiny channels punched open by hooves. The soil in trampled areas held moisture longer than the soil around it. What looked like a trail of tracks was a microengineering project. Thousands of small openings in a sealed surface. This is the point where bison stop being the animal they resemble. They look like oversized cattle. Ecologically, they are a different machine. A cow's hoof presses down and seals. A bison's hoof, heavier, sharper, breaks the crust open and leaves a seedbed behind. Their dung is richer and carries far less livestock disease, feeding the insects and microorganisms that hold soil together in the first place. Then the plants came, not dramatically. Small clusters of grasses and forbs appearing in barren patches that had been written off for decades. Delicate shoots of green pushing up through dust. The first stitches in a tapestry. Then the insects, because there was finally something to eat. Then birds. Birders started reporting sparrows, warblers, larks. Species nobody had recorded in the Henry Mountains in 30 years, nesting again. That wasn't random. New plants brought insects. Insects brought birds. Link by link, a chain was reattaching itself. And the wallows, those dusty depressions bison roll in to shed flies, were catching stormwater and holding it in shallow basins, muddy pits to a casual eye. Functionally, micro-wetlands. Accidental oases in a desert, drawing amphibians and waterfowl. To ranchers and tourists driving through, the country still looked the same. The ecologists knew better. Nature does not come back with fireworks, it creeps. Then the count started to move. 250, then 300, then 350. By year 7, over 400 animals. 10 years after those gates opened, the change was no longer a matter of walking transects and squinting at seedlings. It was visible from orbit. Satellite imagery showed stretches once classified as semi-barren, now carrying real vegetation cover. Grass density up more than 40% in some sectors, enough to change how the land is categorized. Wildflowers returning in carpets across valleys that had been monochrome brown for generations. Streams holding water later into the summer, some of which had gone dry every single year. Coyotes and mountain lions more active, drawn by prey grown fat on better forage. And the herd stood at over 500 animals, healthy, self-sustaining, entirely independent of human help. Critics had predicted a graveyard. What they got looked like a resurrection. But that was the part everyone had been waiting to see. The finding that actually stopped people came out of the same imagery, and nobody had gone looking for it. Once you can map vegetation from space, you can ask a sharper question. Not whether the range recovered, but where. And the answer seemed obvious before anyone checked it. A century of range science says the same thing in every textbook. Grazing is a withdrawal. An animal eats grass, the ground goes into deficit, and the only thing that pays the deficit back is rest. So the recovery had to be sitting in the sectors the herd used least. The resting ground, the country the bison had, spared. The overlays said the opposite. The strongest gains were in the ground the herd had worked hardest. A field biologist looking at that does not announce a discovery. He assumes he has stacked 2 layers wrong. So he pulls the collar data again, runs it against the vegetation index a second time, and gets the same picture back. Heaviest recovery under heaviest use, because the herd never came back. That was the entire thing. Cattle graze a valley and stay until it's stripped. Bison drift. They crop a patch, move on, and by the time they circle back around, seasons have passed. Across a whole range that produced a pattern biologists had already noticed and written off as noise. Some ground grazed to the dirt, some untouched, some halfway regrown. No order to any of it. It wasn't noise, it was a mosaic. Every patch running on its own clock, the entire range holding a full spread of recovery stages at the same time. Tall grass standing next to cropped grass, which is also why fire crawled through that country instead of running. Fire breaks laid down by accident. The land was not recovering despite being eaten. It was recovering because it was being eaten by an animal that in 10 million years never learned how to stand still. That is the sentence that rearranged the file. Not that bison had survived a desert. That grazing, done the way it was done before we replaced it, is not a debt the land pays off afterward. It is the maintenance. The biologists had been calling them ecosystem janitors for years by then, half as a joke. It stopped being one. And underneath it, everything compounded. More vegetation, deeper roots, more carbon held underground, and soil that keeps water longer. A range standing up to each drought a little better than it stood up to the last. It also explains something the ranchers had been reporting for years, before anyone had a word for it. The ones who had fought this hardest had watched their own pastures, the ones bordering bison range, come back stronger, grass bouncing quicker after a dry season, springs running a little longer, their cattle grazing better forage. Hunters reported elk and deers carrying more condition through the lean months. None of them had satellite overlays. They had eyes and ground. They'd walked their whole lives, and they had been describing the mosaic from the outside long before anyone measured it. What everyone had feared as competition was behaving like synergy. Some of the same people who had protested signed land use agreements creating shared grazing zones. Others joined soil health initiatives because of what they had watched happen on their own ground. Wildlife corridors widened. Former opponents started showing up at public meetings to figure out how to live alongside the herd. And the tribes who had been arguing for bison restoration for decades, long before it was fashionable, on cultural grounds as much as ecological ones, suddenly had allies and something better than an argument. They had 500 animals standing in a desert as proof. A battleground of competing values had become a blueprint. Colorado and New Mexico began exploring similar introductions. Ecologists reopened files they had closed years earlier, asking what else might work this way. Elk, pronghorn, wolves. Rewilding stopped being a fringe position. The question stopped being, can we afford this? And became, can we afford not to? But be careful with the ending, because the Henry Mountains do not prove everything. That range succeeded partly because it was never wrecked in the first place. The soils still held native seed. Drop 250 bison onto ground that a century of overgrazing has already turned to hardpan, and you may get a very different result. The brucellosis question was never resolved, only survived. Not every dry year has come yet, and one herd on one plateau in southern Utah does not restore the American West. What it does is settle an argument about method. For a century, conservation meant control. Fences, suppression, irrigation, seed drops, permits, machinery. The Henry Mountains needed none of it. No massive funding, no technology, no hand seeding, and no rescue when the counts went flat and everyone assumed the worst. Only bison and patience. That desert was never dead. It was waiting for the return of the animal that used to keep it alive. And the day those trailers pulled away, Leaving 250 animals alone in country, nobody believed they could survive. That wasn't abandonment, it was trust. What would you have thought if you'd been standing there in 2014, watching those gates swing open? Tell us in the comments.